Many Medicines is recorded on Treaty 8 territory, the unceded lands of the Métis and the homelands of the Cree and Dene peoples. It is an honor to live and work upon these lands, and through this podcast we commit to uplifting Indigenous voices, sharing stories with respect, and walking in a good way with both the community and the land. Tansei, hello and welcome to Many Medicines, the intersection of art, culture, and healing. My name is Stacey Grant, and I am a Métis artist and educator here in Nistawayu, also known as Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo in northeastern Alberta. I created this podcast as a way to make a space where stories are served and honored rather than extracted. I thought it was important for youth to be able to have a place that they could look to where maybe there was a path that they're walking where they needed to see that reflected, or even just to see somebody looking like them. Thank you for being here and enjoy the show.
My name is Claire Antoine. Antoine's my married name. My maiden name is Bolio. I'm originally from Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. Born on my parents' trap line originally. I'm a 60 scoop survivor for 12 years. Moved back home, back on the trap line, and reconnected with my culture.
Do you have any advice for educators, whether they are Indigenous, part of the Indigenous community or not, on how to, I guess, inspire and support children in their learning and be able to have like a connected teaching experience versus maybe checking off a list?
I think, because I'm always learning about, I can talk about one plant or one tree, and there's so much there. And I always tell the teachers, maybe next spring we could gather the plants that I talk about and make a salad. Mm-hmm. And I used to do that when I lived in Peace Point, and my kids were my guinea pigs. How does that taste? Yeah. How does this taste? Because for me, I know it's good for me, so regardless whether it tastes good or bad, I'm still going to eat it.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think to experiment like that, even with the poplar trees, and I talk about the natural yeast on there and how I made a sourdough starter with it, mm-hmm. and how they use the cambrium, the inside pulp, to make flour with, even to make the soap. And I remember going into one of the high schools, and it was a science class, they wanted to pick my brains on some things, and I thought, oh my God, how am I going to do this? But it just came out, and, making the soap, and when I was talking about the things, and the teacher was bringing up the pictures on the screen, and it was interesting to find out that there are still actually some companies making bleach in that old way. And we talk about different ways how people use things, how they did dyes and they use urine, but not necessarily us. And I also, the more I learn about things and knowing how natural dyes work, and why berries are not good for making dyes because they have no tannins in them. And I think a lot of it is what I like to back that up with science. And, I think part of that goes back to when I was in grade 7. We had these two awesome teachers, and they started a program called Outdoor Education, where they used some Indigenous knowledge and they paired it with science. So we would go out, teach us a little bit about plants. We go and check the fish and still study the water. So that was, I think, another time where that interest was starting to grow more.
Yeah.
And then because growing up, when I was working at Parks Canada, like I said, I read a lot. And a lot of the stories they had there were about Indigenous people in the South.
Mm-hmm.
Like Poundmaker, Big Bear, and Almighty Voice. And I thought, that's who I am. Mm-hmm. These Crees, these fierce warriors from the plains. But then when I moved home, I realized this is not me. I'm this bush Cree that lives in the bush. Yeah. We don't do those kind of things, you know. Yeah. So a lot of that changed. So I really wanted to live that kind of life. I wanted to live on the land, be self-sustainable, and be able to provide for myself. So when I met my husband, he's a member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation.
Okay.
And they own a reserve in Wood Buffalo National Park called Peace Point. It's 1 mile by 2 miles. Basically, it was 6, I think, log houses. Yeah. And I homeschooled my kids there. We fished. I had a big garden. And he worked for Parks Canada during the summer firefighting. And because we lived in the park, we had so many tourists come from Europe. They want to come there to see animals in their natural habitat. Okay. Because they overuse their land over there. Yeah. That the only time they get to see wild animals is in sanctuaries. Mm-hmm. So for them to come out there, seeing Indigenous people living in this log house, you know, gardening and fishing, and that's the biggest thrill for them.
Yeah, for sure.
So I started a little store there out of our front room. Mm-hmm. We just sold pop and chips, and I did a lot of baked goods then. Mm-hmm. And picked a lot of mint from the river, made some mint tea. So when tourists came, we just, you know, served them some natural teas and just chatted with them. Mm-hmm. So that was I think I really got into promoting a lot more of that when I lived there. Mm-hmm. So I would do more art. What I did find then was, like, tourists don't want to buy big dream catchers and medallions and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. They just want little tokens.
A little trinket to take home. Yeah.
So what I did was I would go pick river rocks and I would make a picture of a bison on there and just put Peace Point, Alberta, and just varnish it, and paid $5 for that.
Yeah, beautiful. I wonder how many of those pieces exist.
I don't know.
That you made throughout the world now at this point.
There was a time when we were cleaning up the yard and when I was pushing wheelbarrows, grass and stuff. There was a couple that came from England. Yeah. And here they are, they're recording us while we're working. They thought that was the greatest thing. They wanted to go inside and look at the log house. And so our house were split level, so it was wood heated and it was all made of wood. So that was, and I was telling my kids, I wonder how many people have recorded us and taken pictures of us. Yeah. So I used to have this guest book. And I had people that would come, tourists would come and sign the guest book. There was people from everywhere, Israel, Germany, especially East Germany, because they tell us the story about how the wall was broken down and they were able to go out and travel and see the world. Yeah. But that was an eye-opener, and that was a good experience. We lived out there for 10 years. I reconnected with nature and myself, and I know most times it was just me and my kids, because other people just came out, and most of them lived in towns, either in Fort Chip or Fort Smith. Mm-hmm. And when my husband was gone for the summer, it was basically us. So there are times where I had to shoot a bear because it wouldn't be scared away, and my kids were there. And then after I shot it, I found out it was old and it was really smelly and it was sick, so there was a danger there. Yeah. Times where I had to chase bison out of my garden. Yeah. Because they would eat all the tops of everything. So, and my kids learned to hunt and trap out there. It was just like the whole reserve, the wilderness there was our backyard.
Yeah. What does community mean to you, and how do you find it guides your work?
Okay, so because I work at the Storytellers Association Friendship Center, and just over the last few years, because of COVID and the flood and our building getting renovated and just waiting on it to open to the public now, it's interesting when we talk about that, because that in itself is a community.
Yes.
And I think because there's been different ideas about it, but you know what I always say, this is a community, whether it's our indigenous local people that come there or other people that are interested in what we do and learning about culture, but we also have our street people who actually are part of that. It's like a family, and we're one big community.
Yes.
And because of us closing and not having a permanent place to hold our programming and such, we've been bouncing around from space to space, and very thankful that, you know, people have, and other organizations allowed us to have that space. But now that I'm doing my program full-time in the Friendship Center, the numbers are actually coming back.
Yeah.
And they're happy, and that energy is there again. We're a community again. And it's a place where they feel that they fit.
Yeah.
And they're welcome.
Yeah. Beautiful.
You know? And I think we have to remember there's so much similarity in the cultures.
Yes.
Yet there are still those that, and I find like I've done programming with the immigration program with YMCA, and that too has been an eye-opener for me, because I've gone in there to talk about Indigenous culture to newcomers, and someone asked me, why didn't you leave? And I said, why would we want to leave our land? Because you guys were at war, she said. I said, we weren't at war. We signed treaties to share the land. And somehow we got manipulated and things changed.
Yeah.
But we were never at war. And that kind of opened my eyes to how other people see from their perspective, because they assume that's what's happening.
Yeah. And what have they been told and taught where that could be a piece of misinformation?
Oh, yes.
Right.
And that is something, too, that we're always confronted with. And I worked on Suncor site for 8 years. And one of the things, so I was here when the first surge of immigrants came over from Africa. And then the ones from the Philippines. So it was kind of interesting sitting with a lot of co-workers, and we were having lunch, and they were telling me how much they love Canada, and of course I asked them why, and they were telling me about where they come from, and things are not the best over there, and at least they had the freedom to choose and do what they want here and be treated as an equal to everybody. And I thought, yeah, I never really thought of it that way. And it came about how they were told by people, even before coming to Canada, about how the government treat their Indigenous people so well, that they get free money, free housing, free school. The reason why you see them drinking all the time or drunk is because they get free money also from the government. And I'm like, what? If that was the case, I said, wouldn't you think I'd be out there enjoying my free money, my free house, and my free schooling, not here scrubbing
working
toilet bowls?
Yeah.
So those kind of preconception of Indigenous people in here, that needs to be changed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I constantly telling people, and there was a guy at one of there, and he was saying, well, why you guys don't pay taxes? Mm-hmm. You don't have to pay GST on certain things, and why you guys always drunk? I mean, those were like really hurtful words. And I said, you know, there are different things, and if your status, and if you're working on reserve, yes, maybe you get a choice not to pay taxes. Mm-hmm. But the rest of us off reserve, we have to pay taxes. Mm-hmm. And in order to get, you know, a white card that exempts GST on certain things like gas or tobacco, mm-hmm. you have to be treated to do that.
Yeah.
You know, the rest of us all have to pay taxes.
Yeah.
So those things have to be taught. They have to be, you know, made aware that we're not all the same. Mm-hmm. I remember sitting on second floor, and they were having a discussion, and on the list was 2 official languages, English and French. Mm-hmm. And I'm sitting there, and this young Filipino woman turns to me. She says, "You speak French?" I said, "Why would you say that?"
Yeah.
Because there's only two official languages, she told me.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, in your country, how many languages are there? How many dialects?" "Many," she said. "The same here."
Yeah.
So there's a lot of teaching it.
Yeah.
Awareness, I should say.
Yeah, and advocacy that you do in ensuring that people are able to view a more accurate picture of what the communities, the Indigenous communities look like, and also what they've gone through, where, you know, there are reasons why certain people are in spots that maybe people look at them and they see like, oh, that person is in pain. You know, there's this intergenerational factor where it's like that person didn't wake up yesterday and choose to have an addiction, or, you know, it's just that's not how it worked.
Yes. And part of that too is also those connections again, mm-hmm. because I always explain, you know, it didn't only happen to us here, it happened around the world.
Yes.
It happened to the people in Ireland, India, Africa.
Yeah.
And when you start making those connections, and a lot of times I'll have discussions in cabs with the cab driver.
Yeah.
And, you know, they're saying, yes, that's true. You know, they've taken a lot of our knowledge and used it and told us we can't practice our culture.
Yeah.
And that comes back to the medicines. Mm-hmm. And the more I researched, then I said, you know, we have plants that grow in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And one of them is also called sweet flag, what we call rat root here.
Yes.
Actually grows in India also.
Wow.
And if you look at all the stuff that they use it for, it's exactly the same way the Indigenous people here used. Isn't that interesting that they have the same plant, but we're oceans apart, yet they use them the same way?
We had that common thread.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then there's another one I was talking about, is in Artemisia. We have several of them mm-hmm. that grow, and how my dad used to use the one because it has a really good smell to it, and he would use it in his link bait. And I knew there was a medicinal part of it. So I researched that also. So in Asia, they also have it growing there, in Africa. And they use it for anti-malaria medicine.
Wow.
So what happened was, there was a Chinese woman, can't remember her name, but she did research on it, and she actually won a Nobel Prize.
Yeah.
And there's documentaries of people using that had malaria, because what they were being given was something to treat the symptoms rather than the illness itself. Mm-hmm. And he tried it, and he said he never had any symptoms after that.
Yeah.
So it all comes down again to big pharmaceuticals mm-hmm. and the WHO, because that plant is actually banned from being cultivated in certain countries.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
And it's interesting when you find certain plants that actually will, like, where did I read that? Or people will say, for every disease there's a cure. There's a plant. But then again, money and power comes
into play. Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is when we are colonized and conditioned to be like them, not to practice our culture, not pass on that knowledge, then we lose that connection to knowledge, and then we become more dependent on them. Yeah. And right now, when I go into schools, I always tell the kids, we live in a world of convenience right now. Everything is packaged and done up for you. I've taken geese out in my cooking class, and I wanted to show the kids how to pluck it, and they just screamed. After they settled down, they were kind of really curious and, checking it out. And I said, this is what it looks like before it's plucked and prepared and put in stores.
Yeah.
So they were able to pluck it, and they were fine with that. But it's gotten to the point where kids actually don't even know where the food comes from.
Yes.
Like, I've gone into schools and had young kids tell me, you shouldn't kill animals to eat, Do you realize that where most of your food comes from are farms and factories?
When you buy it from the grocery store, just because it doesn't look like an animal anymore doesn't mean that's not where it came from.
So I think if we expose our kids more to the natural side of where our food comes from, and how we garden and grow the thing. I was telling my kids how long it takes for knowledge to be lost? COVID. When COVID happened, everybody was, prepping for the end of the world sort of thing, gardening and everything.
Yeah.
And Facebook, people say, what's going on with my potato plant? It's flopping over.
Yeah.
So I was telling my kids, when I was growing up, and even when you guys were younger, we had gardens. Everybody had a garden in their yard. And everybody had to work in those gardens. And since then, it's been, 20, 30 years that we lived in the city, not many people planting gardens.
Yeah.
That's how long it takes for knowledge to be
1
lost.
to 2 generations, and then it's gone.
If it's not passed on, it's gone.
Yeah.
So these people that were planting potatoes, knowledge on how to plant potatoes and hold them and heal them up as they're growing was lost.
Yeah.
And that's really surprising to me. I never realized,
how quickly that it can go if there wasn't that transfer of or that teaching that went forward.
So I think maybe that was like, if you think about it now, like with the residential school and all that, the 60 scoop, and how I was telling, we were talking about language, and one evening I was thinking, I said, my parents told me I spoke fluent Cree when I was a toddler. And then when we got apprehended, and I was thinking, I don't even remember when I stopped understanding or when I stopped speaking it. Yeah. Because what they were doing then, and I see they're still doing it a little bit now, is they separate the siblings. Yeah. So you have no one to talk to in your language. Yeah. And you have to speak English.
Yeah.
So there's a lot, that when I think back now, how certain things were and how that came into play, how we lost a lot. But, we always think that we're resilient. We've come back. And it's fine if you, are picking up other Indigenous identities and you're connecting with culture and stuff. That's fine. It's great, because I've talked to other people that were in the 60 scoop trying to reach out and connect with family and found they just didn't belong. Yeah. And they're lost.
Yeah.
Which is really sad. And I find now I've gotten to a space now, there's a big food sovereignty thing going on now. And I thought, that just fits in with a lot of what I teach about the plants and how to be self-sustainable. Because I always tell the kids, if anything ever happened disastrously and we had no power, no internet, you poor kids would be lost.
Yes.
Because you don't know how to sustain yourself in those conditions.
Yeah.
You know, I've watched a teenager tell me she knew how to make a fire. She took a big piece of cardboard and a big log, and for 20 minutes we sat there and watched until we decided, okay, maybe she's learned something now, and maybe she should listen to her elders. This is the way you should be doing it.
Yeah.
And I think now with a lot of the land-based teaching that we're doing in the schools, which is really surprising to me when I moved here 21 years ago, because in the Northwest Territories, the majority of the people up there are Indigenous or Inuit, so the culture has always been alive there. And I've had, growing up, elders coming in and teaching us fish scale art, moose hair tufting, and outdoor education, all that stuff. And here, they were still like in the classroom.
Yes.
You know, and a lot of it was just pan-indigenized. It wasn't focusing on local culture.
Yeah.
And not even that, not knowing that there is a difference between groups of people. You know, the Dene are totally different from the Cree.
Yes.
Not in so much the way we live, because the way we live actually, it's your environment that actually dictates that, right? Because you have to know the weather system, you have to know the plants, the animals, and water. And if you took somebody from a woodland area and that knows how to live in the woodland and put them in the plains, they might not know what to do over there. And somebody in the plains that followed the bison and didn't eat fish and, you know, and had to come and live in the woodland area, it would be a little bit confusing for them.
It'd be that learning curve, right?
Yeah. So somebody said, well, why don't you have like long fringes? And I was kind of laughing because there was a story I read about how if you took somebody from the plains with their long fringes, brought them to the woodland areas, they would just getting all tangled up in the dense woods and scaring off all the animals.
Yeah.
So that too makes a difference. And I think because the plains people, they depended a lot on the bison. And then you had the eastern Haudenosaunee and those ones there that grew the corn, the squash, and the beans. They depended a lot on that. And what happened was when the non-Indigenous or colonizers came, in order for them to control those people, they decimated the bison population by killing them off.
Yeah.
They burnt acres and acres of corn, and then those people had no way of sustaining themselves.
Yeah.
So they were more easily controlled.
Yeah.
For the woodland people, at least, we had such a variety of foods to eat. So, and fish was a big thing, and now it seems like
that's another one that's systemically, you know, because it seems like it is very systemic, where things will be presented as a coincidence or something like that, but there's a level of intention behind it that happened.
That's why I think it's very important that we go into schools and we do the land-based teaching, even if it's not only cultural, but it's just basic life skills.
Yes.
I think every kid should know how to make a fire. Yes. When I was growing up, I remember making fires, using a knife to make whistles in the spring from willows, and, you know, all those good things. And it's funny because I remember going for a walk last year with St. Anne's School and Birchwood Trail on that side, and we were doing the willows and the natural aspirin, and we were peeling. And then I had this cutter, and I was saying, you know, when I was a kid, I used to chew on these sticks in the spring because it has a really sweet taste.
Yeah.
So kids wanted to try it. There was this one kid, no, I don't want to try it. But once he saw that everybody was enjoying it, and he said, how's it taste? And this kid would say, oh, it tastes really good.
Yeah.
So then he wanted the stick, and everybody's chewing on these little sticks.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, simple little things like that. It makes a difference. And I think it's really important that we do teach our kids how to be self-sustainable, that they become too dependent on having other people try things or do things for them. And I remember, because I have a son that was constantly making me go to court. when he was underage, and there was another person there, and he was saying, we tried to give our kids everything we never had to make it easier for them, but we weren't doing any favors for them.
Yeah.
They weren't learning, and they weren't having to face consequences of their own actions. And I see a lot of that now. We just kind of are so scared by offending people. And how do we know as parents, we want to be sure that our kids can be able to take care of themselves when we're not there.
Yeah.
And when we keep on, catering to them, providing for them, we're not doing them any favors. So I think it's really important that what we do is, not only just teaching them, but making sure that they're being able to, that's just like making sure that mankind will survive.
Yeah. Well, and be able to carry forward that level of self-sustainability. It's like we were talking about earlier. I'm like, the children crave survival skills.
Yes.
When they learn about a plant or they learn this skill, it really increases their confidence as well, right? Because when we're able to feel like we are able, that we are competent and we can do things, that raises a child's confidence and a grown-up's confidence so much more than if you feel like you have no control of your destiny or your well-being, right? So mental health wise, I feel like that's also a big thing that could help with that.
And I think a lot of it is if we could get more connection to Mother Earth, because part of that too, and I was saying about how some people were saying, well, they wanted scientific proof that these things actually work, and it had to do with smudging, and so smudging can be. There's something called smoke cleansing that's practiced worldwide. Smudging is more specific to the indigenous people of the Americas. So what that was doing when you smudge or you're smoking, like lighting incense and smoking, it's actually letting off negative ions into the environment, and that's responsible for that, getting rid of any negative energy and making you feel good. And you get the same thing when you're in nature. That's why being in nature and doing things. Remember my son going out with his dad, and he called me. He said, I just chopped wood today, and I could hear the wind in the trees, and he felt so good that he did that because he did it in order to sustain himself. And if kids can do something like even just cooking in a class, and knowing that they did that for themselves, that really builds up their self-esteem.
Absolutely. So I want to circle back to the beginning of our conversation, where you said that at certain points throughout your life, you had a hard time kind of realizing what your purpose was. Now with your role as a knowledge keeper and someone who is a teacher of youth and grown-ups, but youth, do you feel like you have found your purpose as you've walked this journey?
I don't know if it's so much a purpose, but I think passing on that knowledge, and part of it too is bringing awareness to non-Indigenous people. And I also want, as I said a couple times before in different meetings and stuff, we've been through a lot, and there's a lot of us that are still carrying a lot of anger and hurt. And I realize that, and there's times where certain things will trigger me. But I want us to go forward. I want to be proactive, and what I like to do now is instill pride into Indigenous youth and even people. And like I was talking about the food sovereignty, there was a thing on TikTok, and there was an Indigenous guy, and I said, why are you arguing with these people that, want you to prove things? Like, the question was, where's your temples? Where's your roads? Or your food? What did you Indigenous people contribute? So, of course, now I work with a lot with plants and that, and what I always say, like, we lived here for thousands of years, and there's scientific proof and evidence collected that we've been here for maybe even longer than that.
Yeah.
But we lived here without interference from the outside world, with the knowledge that was passed on and used.
Yeah.
And maybe we didn't feel the need to build roads and temples because everything was provided for us.
Yeah.
And in order to instill that idea, I always tell them that, the majority of food staples in people's kitchen is actually, most of it was cultivated by Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
Your potatoes.
Mm-hmm.
And it just happened that I was doing a program, and there was a lady there from Chile, and her parents just happened to be visiting.
Mm-hmm.
So we had that discussion, and she said, yes, we have over 100 varieties of potatoes.
Yeah.
Corn, which was actually maize back then, was not a thing until they decided, the Aztecs, to cross-pollinate a couple of grasses. And here we have corn. It's been, since then it's changed over the years, but that's where corn came from.
Yeah.
And then you have your squash.
Yeah.
And your beans. And then, of course, then I always say, what would Italy be without tomatoes if it wasn't for the Indigenous people of Mexico?
Yeah.
And bell peppers and blueberries and cocoa, and so those are things that Indigenous people contribute. Now people will say, like, I never really, what got me on that track was I decided to do corn husk dolls.
Ooh.
And so I wanted to see how to do a authentic original corn husk doll, and that's when I found out it came from the Cherokee people.
Oh.
There's actually a little legend behind that corn husk doll, but we got so conditioned and used to seeing the little pilgrim corn husk dolls that we didn't realize that that's where the corn came from.
Yeah.
And those legends and those stories that they took it and adapted.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have taken things and shared things with other people, like Bannock, with the Scottish people, they used oak and rye. We were introduced to wheat because we didn't have wheat, but we also had a lot of other things that we used to make flour with.
Yeah.
And not only that, corn. And so I always say, we have to instill pride in the youth and say, we contribute a lot.
Yeah.
And not only is it the foods, but the medicines.
Mm-hmm.
And we need also to learn to respect Mother Earth. And everybody says, no, this is our land. But, nobody really owns land. We are the caretakers of Mother Earth.
Yeah.
And in order to be self-sustainable, we need to also take care of the earth.
Absolutely. And I think that ties into my last question for you, where is there one lesson or story that you would like for the audience to take away from this conversation that you hope that they carry with them?
I think it's we've let the government kind of label us and separate us as people, not only Indigenous people, but as humans in general, And right now, you just look at what's going on around the world. There's so much hatred and fighting and entitlement.
Yeah.
And I think we need to remember, we depend on each other. And if we keep on destroying Mother Earth, there's not going to be anything here for the future generations. And I think that's what we should be concentrating on, what's going to be left for them.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I wanted to say thank you so much for being here. Like I said, I could talk to you all day, so we're definitely going to have more conversations, either on camera or off, but whatever you'd like. Do you have any shout outs do you want to do? Do you want to say where we can find info about the Friendship Center? we'll put little links up on the screen where if people want to join the programming and stuff.
Sure.
But
So we have a website, but I always tell people just go on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram. I don't have the other one, so I always go on Facebook. So on Facebook, we do have a link that'll take you to the web page, and it'll tell you which programs are upcoming. Mine is every Thursday, except for the last Thursday of the month when we have our Elder Supper. And you don't have to be Indigenous to join us.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again for coming. You are someone who I greatly admire. Like I said, you were on the top of my list when I found out that this was a project that I was doing, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to build a relationship with you and learning from you, because I've already learned so much. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you. It was enjoyable.